In 2077, over 400,000 Americans won the lottery. Not for cash, not for a car. They won a spot in a Vault-Tec vault, a sealed underground shelter built to survive nuclear war. As the air raid sirens screamed and the sky turned white, they descended into the earth with their families, grateful to be among the lucky few. What they didn't know, what nobody could have known, was that Vault-Tec never built those shelters to save them. The company spent 20 years and billions of dollars constructing 122 vaults across America, each one marketed as humanity's last hope. But hope wasn't the product. Every vault was designed to fail. Some would flood with radiation on purpose. Others would pit their residents against each other in engineered social experiments. A few would simply never open, sealing their occupants inside until the air recyclers gave out. The vaults were never about preservation. They were laboratories, and the residents were specimens. To understand why Vault-Tec built a nationwide network of tombs, we need to go back to where it all started. Vault-Tec Corporation was founded in 2054 as a defense contractor, one of dozens competing for government contracts as the world tore itself apart. The resource wars had been burning for 15 years. Oil reserves in the Middle East ran dry in 2060. The European Commonwealth dissolved into warring nation-states by 2060. China invaded Alaska in 2066 for its last remaining oil fields. By the early 2070s, the United States government knew what was coming. Nuclear war wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a certainty on the calendar. Vault-Tec won the contract to build Project Safehouse in 2054, a network of public fallout shelters that would preserve American civilization underground. Construction began in 2063. The company's stock tripled. Families across the country entered lotteries, paid bribes, or begged for vault spots as the bombs drew closer. On paper, it was the greatest humanitarian project in history. 122 vaults, each designed to house 500 to 1,000 people for 10 to 200 years, equipped with hydroponics, water purification, and everything needed to rebuild on the surface. The advertising promised safety, community, and a future. The vault dwellers believed it, right up until the doors sealed behind them on October 23, 2077. But Vault-Tec wasn't working alone. The Enclave formed sometime in the 2060s, a shadow government within the government, made up of the President, the Joint Chiefs, corporate executives, and members of the military-industrial complex. They didn't see nuclear war as a tragedy to prevent. They saw it as a crucible, a necessary reset that would burn away the old world and let something new emerge. They believed humanity's survival required adaptation, and adaptation required pressure. In 2071, the Enclave approached Vault-Tec's executive board with a proposal. The vaults would still be built. The public would still believe they were shelters. But the real purpose would be different. Each vault would become a controlled experiment, testing how humans respond to isolation, radiation, genetic manipulation, psychological stress, and social engineering. The data would be collected, analyzed, and used to design the perfect society for a post-war world. Vault-Tec accepted. The Societal Preservation Program was born, and with it, the true blueprint for every vault in America. A handful would function as promised, control groups to measure the experiments against. The rest would be twisted into something else, their residents repurposed as test subjects without consent or knowledge. By 2077, the vaults were ready. The only thing left was to wait for the bombs. What they proposed would turn 122 shelters into something else entirely. The Enclave called it the Societal Preservation Program. On paper, the vaults would test humanity's ability to survive in isolated environments for generations. gathering data for an eventual colonization mission beyond Earth. Each vault became a variable in a much larger equation, designed to answer questions about social cohesion, genetic adaptation, and psychological endurance under controlled conditions. The program's architects weren't preparing for life after nuclear war. They were preparing for life after Earth itself. Vault-Tec's contract specified that every shelter would serve dual purpose: immediate protection from atomic fire and long-term laboratory for whatever came next. 122 facilities, 122 different parameters, all feeding data back to whoever survived to read it. Some experiments were subtle, minor tweaks to air composition, slight variations in resource distribution, carefully managed population ratios. Others pushed further, testing how far social structures could bend before they shattered completely. The Enclave wanted to know what killed communities first: scarcity, isolation, or each other. Vault-Tec scientists started designing the experiments in 2063, and some of them understood exactly what they were building. The Overseer's manual arrived in a locked case, accessible only through biometric scan, and a 12-digit code changed every 90 days. Most Overseers received standard operating procedures: population management, resource allocation, emergency protocols for radiation breach or equipment failure. But select Overseers opened their manuals to find a second document, printed on different paper, labeled Classification Level Omega. These pages outline the Vault's true function: not shelter, laboratory. The Overseer's role wasn't protector or leader, it was experimental administrator, responsible for implementing specific social conditions and recording the results. Vault-Tec provided detailed timelines: when to introduce resource shortages, when to restrict information, when to enforce population controls. Some manuals included psychological scripts, exact phrases designed to manufacture specific emotional responses in the Vault population. The classified sections specified data collection requirements: weekly reports on social cohesion metrics, monthly psychological evaluations, annual genetic samples transmitted to external monitoring stations through hardline connections the residents would never find. Overseers were told their cooperation ensured humanity's survival among the stars. What the manuals didn't mention was whether anyone would still be listening when the data arrived. Not every Overseer received the same instructions. Vault 8 had no experiment. Its manual contained standard operating procedures and nothing else. No hidden agenda, no psychological manipulation protocols. The facility was designed as a control group, a baseline against which every other Vault's results could be measured. 1,000 residents, balanced demographics, sufficient resources for 200 years, and a GECK rated for 150 square miles of terraforming once the all-clear sounded. The Vault opened on schedule in 2091, 10 years after the bombs fell. Its residents emerged into a scorched Nevada landscape and used the GECK exactly as intended, establishing agricultural infrastructure and purified water sources within 18 months. By 2241, Vault City stood as a fully functioning settlement of 350 citizens, complete with functional power grid, medical facilities, and strict immigration policies that would make pre-war governments proud. Vault 8 proved the technology worked. Given proper supplies, clear leadership, and no external interference, Vault dwellers could rebuild civilization from scratch. The irony wasn't lost on Vault-Tec's planners. Their one honest shelter succeeded precisely because they'd left it alone. But Vault 8 was one of only 3 control vaults, and the others didn't fare as well. Most vaults weren't designed to save anyone. They were sacrifice vaults, built to fail in specific measurable ways. Vault-Tec engineers installed faulty water chips, reduced rations to starvation levels, and rigged life support systems to break down within months. The goal was to watch communities collapse under controlled conditions and record exactly how long it took. Vault 11 took this further. Every year, residents had to vote for one person to be executed by the vault's automated systems, or the computer would kill everyone. The overseer's terminal made it clear: sacrifice one, or lose all 500. For decades, they held elections. Campaign posters lined the halls. Political blocs formed, traded favors, and destroyed rivals to avoid the sacrifice chamber. By 2282, only 5 people remained. They'd been killing each other for generations, one vote at a time, and the survivors finally couldn't stomach another election. What happened when they refused to kill anyone reveals something about Vault-Tec's cruelty. The 5 survivors gathered in the atrium and decided together: no more sacrifices. If the vault killed them all, at least they'd die human. They waited for the gas, the lockdown, the inevitable end. Instead, the computer congratulated them. A pre-recorded message explained they'd pass the experiment. The vault would open. They were free to leave, and always had been. 4 of them pulled out pistols and shot themselves within minutes. The sole survivor, a woman whose audio logs you can find near the entrance, described the sound of bodies hitting the floor. She walked out into the Mojave alone, leaving behind 200 years of unnecessary corpses and a vault that had been testing obedience, not survival. The computer had one more message queued: congratulations, residents. You've shown the strength to stand against authority. Vault-Tec hadn't cared if anyone lived or died. They wanted to know how long fear could override morality, and whether a community would murder its own rather than risk collective punishment. This wasn't about survival data. It was about breaking people to see what remained. Vault 12 in Bakersfield never sealed. The entrance door was designed with a deliberate flaw, a hydraulic failure built into the mechanism from day one. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, residents crowded into the vault, expecting safety, and found themselves staring at a door stuck open by 4 feet. Radiation poured in at lethal concentrations for weeks. Vault-Tec's hypothesis was simple: document the rate and process of ghoulification in a controlled population. Over months, skin peeled, hair fell out, and 200 residents transformed into radiation-saturated ghouls, while the vault sensors recorded tissue decay, cognitive function, and life expectancy. By 2083, Vault 12 had become Necropolis, a functioning ghoul city with its own government, water supply, and fierce independence from the outside world. The ghouls survived everything Vault-Tec threw at them. They adapted, organized, and built something resembling civilization in the ruins of Bakersfield. For 80 years they endured, proving radiation couldn't kill what it transformed. The residents survived radiation only to face something worse decades later. Vault 13 was supposed to stay closed for 200 years. No contact with the surface, no exceptions. The Societal Preservation Program wanted data on extended isolation, on whether a community could maintain cohesion when the outside world became a memory, passed down through generations. The vault's water purification chip was the linchpin of the experiment. It was designed to fail at a specific time, forcing the overseer to make an impossible choice: send someone into the irradiated wasteland or watch 1,000 people die of thirst. The overseer knew. Documentation buried in the command terminal laid it out in clinical language. The chip's failure wasn't a malfunction. It was the experiment's trigger. For 84 years, every overseer carried that knowledge, waiting for the day the vault's perfect isolation would shatter. When the water chip failed in 2061, one resident was chosen to leave, and everything changed. Vault 15 received a different kind of test. Vault-Tec handpicked residents from the most incompatible ideological backgrounds they could find. Hardcore survivalists, religious fundamentalists, communist collectives, and rugged individualists, all crammed into the same confined space. The experiment asked a simple question: would diversity under pressure breed cooperation or collapse? Vault-Tec sociologists predicted fracture within 50 years. They were optimistic. By 2097, Vault 15 had splintered into armed factions. The door opened not to release a unified community, but to set loose ideological warfare onto the Mojave wasteland. Each group carried their vault-born convictions like weapons, convinced their way was the only path to survival. The tribes that emerged would shape the entire region for generations. 3 raider clans crawled out of Vault 15's ruins. The Khans, disciples of strength and martial honor. The Vipers, religious zealots who worshipped a mutated vision of the old world. The Jackals, who embraced pure survival at any cost, even cannibalism. Each clan's tactics reflected their vault-born ideology. The Khans attacked in organized formations, demanding tribute and respect. The Vipers ambushed travelers as sacrifices to their serpent god. The Jackals just killed and scavenged, philosophy reduced to hunger. For decades, they terrorized the wastes between New California and Nevada. Caravans paid protection money or died. Settlements fortified or burned. The NCR's early expansion wars were fought as much against Vault 15's children as against the wasteland itself. One of these tribes would eventually try to become something more than raiders. Vault 19 was built into the mountains north of Vegas with a single instruction buried in its design documents: divide the population into red and blue sectors. Give each group conflicting orders about resource allocation and security protocols, and watch what happens when paranoia becomes policy. The overseer received weekly guidance from Vault-Tec. Tell red sector that blue was hoarding supplies. Tell blue that red was planning a takeover. Installed tinted lighting so every corridor reinforced which side you belonged to. The residents knew they were being split into groups, but they didn't know why, and that uncertainty turned into suspicion within months. By year 3, fistfights in shared spaces became routine. By year 5, both sectors had armed themselves with improvised weapons and posted guards at the dividing bulkheads. The civil war that followed lasted 6 days and killed 87% of the Vault's population before the survivors fled into the Mojave. Decades after everyone died, criminals would find the Vault and make the same mistakes. Vault 22 was sold to its residents as an agricultural research station, a place where humanity's best botanists would develop crops that could feed the wasteland. The experiment was real, but the crops weren't wheat or corn. Vault-Tec wanted to test a genetically modified fungal spore designed to kill pests without harming plants or people. The spores were effective. Insects died within hours of exposure, and the Vault's hydroponic gardens flourished for 3 years without a single failed harvest. Then the mutations started. The fungus adapted to mammalian hosts faster than anyone predicted, colonizing lung tissue and rewriting neurochemistry to prioritize spore dispersal over survival. Infected residents became carriers, walking through the ventilation systems and spreading spores into every sealed chamber. The transformation took weeks, then days, then hours, as the fungus refined itself with each new host. By the time the science team realized containment had failed, 90% of the vault was already infected. The last survivors sealed the vault from the outside and walked into the Mojave, coughing. What grew in Vault 22 didn't stay contained. Vault 27 was assigned 2,000 residents and given supplies calculated for 400. The math was deliberate. Vault-Tec's projections estimated total collapse in 4 to 6 months, and they wanted to document every stage of resource competition under extreme scarcity. The water recyclers failed in week 9, running beyond rated capacity until the filtration membranes tore. Rations were cut to 800 calories per person per day by month 2, then 400, then distributed by lottery. The first murder over food happened on day 47. The first evidence of cannibalism appeared in the medical logs 11 days later.
The overseer's final report, dated 5 months after the doors sealed, describes the ventilation system breaking down under the heat of too many bodies in too little space. He noted that riots had killed the security staff, that the lower levels had gone dark, and that he could hear screaming through the walls. The report ends mid-sentence. Vault-Tec didn't bother monitoring this one after the first year. Vault 29 held 15 children. No adults, no parents, no teachers, just kids under 15 and a brain in a jar named Harold, wired into the vault's intercom system to issue instructions. The experiment wanted to see what happens when children raise themselves, when every social norm has to be invented from scratch by people who've never seen how it's done. Harold's voice crackled through the speakers with schedules, tasks, basic rules. The children obeyed because they didn't know any different. They formed their own hierarchy, their own codes, their own understanding of power and obedience. No one taught them empathy. No one modeled restraint. They learned survival, efficiency, and something cold that passed for loyalty.
The terminals tracked their development in clinical language. Subject 4 exhibited leadership traits. Subject 9 required corrective isolation. By age 12, they were running the vault themselves, a miniature society built on whatever Harold's instructions and their own instincts could produce. Vault-Tec watched for 18 years, then stopped logging. The data was complete. When Caesar's Legion found these adults decades later, they saw something useful.
Vault 34 had more guns than people. The armory was packed with rifles, pistols, explosives, and enough ammunition to fight a war. The overseer made a single miscalculation. He locked it all down, restricted access, turned the weapons into a privilege only he controlled. In a culture that had been taught to worship those guns, to see them as the solution to every problem, that was gasoline on a fuse.
The uprising took 3 days. Security fell in the first few hours. The overseer barricaded himself in his office and died there when they breached the door. The rebels had the weapons, had the vault, and had no idea what they'd just done to the reactor. Stray gunfire and explosives had torn through coolant lines, shredded control systems, and sent radiation levels climbing past the point of no return.
The logs show people trying to fix it, then trying to survive it, then just trying to die somewhere away from the worst of it. Radiation poisoning turns a vault into a tomb, slowly, with plenty of time to understand what's happening. Most of them stayed, either too sick to move or too stubborn to abandon what they'd fought for. A small group escaped before the reactor went critical, taking the weapons obsession with them. Vault 36's food extruders worked perfectly. They produced a thin, flavorless gruel, just enough to keep you alive and just little enough to keep you hungry. The supply closets were full. Protein powder, nutrient paste, sealed rations, everything you'd need to feed 500 people for 200 years. The extruders were programmed to ignore it all and keep pumping out starvation rations.
The residents complained, then pleaded, then started breaking into locked storage, only to find supplies they couldn't access or use. Hunger does things to people. It sharpens you, then it breaks you. The logs document petty theft, hoarding, violence over scraps. A woman killed her neighbor for hiding 2 cans of paste. A man tried to eat his own belt. Within 4 years, the population had dropped by 60%, most from malnutrition and the fights that came with it. The rest died slower, bodies cannibalizing themselves while the extruders kept running and the storage closets stayed locked. The experiment measured how long social order lasts when everyone's starving and the system offers no relief. The overseer's hidden stash tells you everything about the experiment's real purpose.
Vault 42 stripped out every noise-making device before the doors sealed. No intercoms, no alarm bells, no music players. The recreation terminals had their speakers removed, the workshop tools were padded with rubber, and every door hinge was coated in graphite lubricant. Residents received written instructions prohibiting any sound above a whisper, enforced by the overseer's security team with immediate disciplinary action.
The experiment wanted to measure sensory deprivation's psychological toll in a controlled environment where subjects couldn't escape the silence. Within 18 months, the medical logs reported widespread insomnia, auditory hallucinations, and paranoid behavior. Parents stopped singing to their children because security would file reports. Couples communicated through hastily scribbled notes, their handwriting deteriorating as fine motor control degraded from chronic stress. By year 5, the vault population had developed mass psychosis. Terminal entries describe residents standing motionless for hours, mouths moving without sound, convinced they were screaming. Others covered their ears and rocked in corners, overwhelmed by noises only they could hear. The overseer's final report noted that 73% of residents exhibited symptoms of severe dissociative disorders. The last logs were written by someone who'd forgotten how to speak aloud. Vault 43's manifest listed 999 women, 1 man, and 1 panther. The big cat arrived sedated in a reinforced crate 3 days before the bombs fell, part of Vault-Tec's psychological warfare division testing extreme population imbalance under constant predatory threat. The man was selected for genetic compatibility with the female population, a 28-year-old agricultural engineer who thought he'd won a lottery for vault placement. The panther lived in a climate-controlled habitat, connected to the main atrium by reinforced glass and a series of access tunnels the residents couldn't fully monitor. It was fed on a schedule designed to keep it hungry enough to be aggressive, but healthy enough to survive for decades. The animal's presence rewired every social interaction in the vault. Women traveled in groups, slept in shifts, and installed makeshift barriers in corridors the panther could theoretically access. The man became simultaneously the most protected and most resented person in the facility, a genetic resource guarded by competing factions who'd formed around different survival philosophies. The overseer's encrypted files track reproduction rates, social hierarchies, and incidents of violence with clinical detachment. By year 12, the panther had killed 4 residents who'd entered maintenance tunnels alone. By year 20, something had killed the panther, and the files don't specify what. What they built in those conditions barely resembled a human society. Vault 53 was engineered to fail. Every critical system, water purification, life support, power distribution, was built with components designed to malfunction at randomized intervals. The reactor would flicker offline for 6 hours, then stabilize for 3 days, then die for 18 hours, with no pattern the residents could predict. Water pumps seized without warning. Air scrubbers clogged on schedules that defeated every maintenance routine the engineers attempted. The experiment measured problem-solving ability and social cohesion under perpetual crisis conditions where no solution ever lasted. Repair crews worked 16-hour shifts trying to stay ahead of cascade failures, only to watch systems they'd just fixed break down again before they'd left the room. The overseer's logs document 347 separate equipment failures in the first year alone. By year 2, the maintenance chief had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and was restrained in medical after attacking the reactor console with a wrench.
The vault emptied out in year 3, when a simultaneous failure of life support and door mechanisms created a 40-minute window before the system reset. 68 residents fled into the wasteland rather than spend another day waiting for the next disaster. The rest followed over the next 6 months, abandoning the facility in small groups whenever the doors malfunctioned. Vault-Tec's monitoring equipment recorded every departure, tracking which failures triggered the final exodus. The survivors carried that paranoia into the wasteland with them. Vault 55 stripped entertainment down to nothing. No games, no music, no art supplies. The library held technical manuals and maintenance guides, nothing else. Residents could work, eat, sleep, and stare at blank walls. Vault-Tec wanted to measure how long humans could function without leisure before the mind started to crack. The first 3 months showed irritability and insomnia. By month 6, residents were spending hours in empty rec rooms, sitting in silence because there was nowhere else to go. Month 8 brought the first breakdown. A maintenance worker who tried to paint murals with his own blood on the concrete walls. Security restrained him. The medical team sedated him. The experiment continued. Conversations grew shorter. Faces grew blank. People forgot how to smile because there was nothing to smile about. The overseer's logs recorded increasing aggression over minor disputes, fistfights over meal portions, arguments that escalated into threats. It took 11 months before the first murder. Vault 56 ran the opposite experiment. Every luxury Vault-Tec could cram into a single facility. Unlimited alcohol, recreational drugs distributed through automated dispensers, a casino floor, arcades, theaters running 24 hours. No work requirements, no curfews, no restrictions.
The first month looked like paradise. Residents threw parties that lasted days. The medical bay stocked narcotics like aspirin. Vault-Tec's cameras watched them celebrate their luck, toasting to survival while the world burned above.
By month 4, the casino ran constantly, but the games had stopped being fun. Overdoses climbed. The medical staff, high on their own supply, stopped responding to emergencies. Residents who wanted structure or purpose found neither, drifting through a facility designed to encourage drift. Month 9 saw the social fabric collapse entirely. No one maintained the systems. No one cleaned. Fights broke out over drug supplies even though the dispensers still worked. The final log entry, written by a barely coherent overseer, recorded 67 overdose deaths in the previous week. Abundance destroyed them faster than deprivation destroyed Vault 55. Vault-Tec built Vault 68 and Vault 69 as mirror experiments in gender imbalance. Vault 68 held 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 held 999 women and 1 man. Both vaults received identical resources, identical layouts, identical monitoring equipment. The company's hypothesis predicted both vaults would develop similar power structures, with a single minority individual, either elevated or scapegoated. The data told a different story. Vault 68's logs showed escalating violence within the first year, factions forming around access to the lone woman, who spent most of her time in protective custody that resembled imprisonment. Vault 69's records painted a more stable picture initially. The lone man held no formal authority, but became a figurehead in disputes. By year 3, birth rates had climbed and a council government had formed. Both vaults survived longer than Vault-Tec predicted, but the psychological damage ran deep in ways the monitors couldn't quantify. Security footage from both facilities showed isolation, paranoia, and social structures warped by impossible ratios. Vault 68 descended into tribal violence. Vault 69 developed rigid hierarchies around reproduction and resource allocation. The two vaults' opposite compositions led to outcomes that weren't opposite at all. Vault 70 stripped out every television, every holotape player, every radio. In their place, Vault-Tec installed puppet theaters throughout the common areas and a sophisticated control terminal in the recreation wing. The catch was simple. Only one specific jumpsuit could interface with the terminals, and only one resident received that jumpsuit.
For the first few weeks, the resident with the control suit performed shows for packed audiences. Children sat cross-legged in front of the stages, while their parents stood in the back. But as the novelty faded and the puppeteer grew tired, the performances became sporadic. Days would pass with dark stages and silent common rooms. The overseer's logs document the shift. Residents began offering favors, then rations, then pre-war valuables for a single hour at the controls. Marriages were proposed. Threats were made in maintenance corridors. Security had to escort the suit wearer between their quarters and the cafeteria because crowds would form, pressing close, asking when the next show would be. Vault-Tec's experiment measured how a community reacts when entertainment becomes a monopoly held by one person, when distraction itself is rationed. The answer came within 6 months. The jumpsuit became the most valuable object in the entire vault. Vault 77, sealed with a single occupant and a wooden crate. The manifest listed the crate's contents as recreational supplies. Inside were puppets, dozens of them, cloth and foam faces staring up when the resident pried the lid open on day 3. His first audio log is calm, almost amused. He names a few of the puppets, sets them on the cafeteria tables, mentions that he'll give them personalities to pass the time. By week 4, he's performing full shows in the empty recreation room, changing his voice for each character. The terminal records show he ran the vault's lighting systems to simulate stage spots and audience applause. Month 7, the logs begin to blur. He discusses plot arcs spanning weeks, arguments between puppet characters that he mediates, romantic subplots he's trying to resolve. He moves puppets between living quarters based on their relationships. He sets a cafeteria table for 30, one puppet in each chair, and rotates their positions daily to prevent cliques from forming. The final dozen logs span 3 years. His voice stays level, his explanations careful and deliberate. He describes the Puppet Council's vote on water rationing, the wedding he officiated between 2 sock-based characters, the trial he conducted when one puppet was accused of stealing supplies. His logs describe conversations with the puppets that sound almost rational at first. Vault 77 opened from the inside in 2462. The resident emerged into the Mojave with a duffel bag and began moving east. Caravan reports from that year describe a man in a vault suit, alone, who would approach campfires at night and sit just outside the light without speaking. The violence started near Bullhead City. A slaver gang found him sleeping in a drainage ditch and tried to collar him. 3 days later, a prospector discovered the camp. All 7 slavers were dead, arranged in a circle around a pile of chains. The vault suit was gone, but witnesses in the next settlement reported seeing it heading toward Arizona. Over the next 4 years, the stories accumulated and merged into legend. A vault dweller who traveled alone, who left bodies posed in strange tableaus, who never took supplies or caps, just kept walking. Traders started calling him the Puppet Man, after a raider den was found with crude sock puppets placed over the corpse's hands. The name stuck, then twisted into something worse. By 2166, caravan guards would detour 20 miles to avoid reported sightings. Slaver networks passed descriptions on their radio channels. The pattern held across Arizona, New Mexico, and into Texas. Corpses positioned carefully, personal effects untouched, and that blue and yellow suit walking away into the dust. Even raiders learned to run from the puppet vault suit. Vault 87 never held civilians. The facility in the Capitol Wasteland was repurposed in 2076, a full year before the bombs, for something the Department of Defense called the Evolutionary Experimentation Program. They weren't testing survival, they were manufacturing weapons. The forced evolutionary virus came from Vault-Tec, the same company that created power armor. Vault 87's scientists were told they'd refine it, create super soldiers immune to radiation. Instead, the FEV turned human tissue into something that kept growing, kept mutating, until nothing human remained but rage and hunger.
When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, the scientists were already inside, already working. The external radiation damaged containment protocols. Within 48 hours, the staff made a choice: keep testing or become test subjects themselves. They chose testing. By 2078, every scientist in Vault 87 had been exposed. The super mutants of the Capitol Wasteland trace back to that first batch, those first volunteers who walked into the FEV chambers believing they'd retain their minds. The residents never even made it inside before the experiments began. Vault 92 recruited exclusively from America's finest musicians. The promotional materials promised a preserved archive of human culture, recording studios that would outlast the apocalypse. 245 artists accepted, from symphony violinists to jazz pianists to opera singers. The white noise played through every speaker, every room, starting 6 months after the doors sealed. Vault-Tec called it Project Immortal Melody, testing whether subliminal messages embedded in sound could program complex behaviors. The goal was sleeper agents who'd never know they'd been activated until a specific musical phrase triggered them.
Zoe Hammerstein, first chair violin, started documenting the changes in her holotape journal. Day 94, headaches during practice. Day 140, violent dreams she couldn't remember. Day 203, she watched her stand partner strangle another resident during a Brahms rehearsal, and couldn't recall why she'd been holding a knife herself. By 2078, the vault had gone silent. The overseer's final log noted complete psychological collapse across 87% of residents. Zoe's last recording was 34 seconds of her playing a child's lullaby, then screaming, then silence. The music didn't just drive them mad, it made them killers.
Vault 101 sealed on October 23, 2077, with 504 residents. The experiment was simple: never open. Not in 10 years, not in 100, not ever. Test whether a human population could sustain itself in complete isolation across generations, whether they'd forget the outside world existed at all.
The overseer received absolute authority. Every regulation designed to concentrate power in a single bloodline. By 2177, 3 generations had lived and died without seeing sunlight. The children learned about the wasteland as mythology, ancient history, something their great-grandparents might have invented. The word outside became profanity. Security grew tighter with each decade. Radios were banned in 2097 after someone picked up a caravan signal. In 2231, the overseer ordered all pre-war books describing the surface world burned. By 2270, asking about the door's mechanisms meant interrogation, possibly worse. The vault became its own country, with a population that never exceeded 512. Vault-Tec's projections estimated the seal would last 450 years before resource depletion or inbreeding made the population unviable. The plan assumed compliance, assumed no one would question, assumed the overseer's power would never crack. In 2277, one birth broke a 200-year seal. Vault 106 was sealed with 107 residents and a modified atmospheric system. 10 days later, psychoactive compounds began venting into the air supply at precisely 0300 hours. The experiment's objective was to measure the rate of societal collapse under sustained hallucinogenic exposure and document behavioral patterns during mass psychosis.
Within 48 hours, residents reported shadow figures in the corridors and voices speaking from the walls. By day 7, security logs describe armed confrontations with intruders that surveillance footage shows never existed. The overseer's final audio entry, recorded on day 19, catalogs 3 different hostile factions attempting simultaneous breaches from sectors that had no exterior access.
Medical records recovered from the vault show 11 deaths from self-inflicted wounds, 34 from violence between residents, and 62 unaccounted for in sections where the bodies were never found. The pharmacological compound remained stable in the ventilation system for at least 8 weeks. Their final entries describe threats that were never there. Vault 108 operated a fully functional cloning facility, ostensibly to maintain genetic diversity in a closed population of 475 residents. The equipment worked exactly as designed. The problem was the source template they chose to duplicate. A maintenance worker named Gary became the first emergency clone after a reactor accident in 2078 created immediate personnel shortages. The cloning process introduced cumulative neurological degradation with each generation, but Vault-Tec's automation protocols didn't recognize the defect. By 2097, there were 54 Gary clones. By 2102, the original residents had either fled to the surface or been killed in the lower levels. Security footage from the vault shows the clones moving in coordinated groups, responding to threats they couldn't possibly have communicated about. They displayed pack behaviors and territorial patterns, dividing the vault into zones marked with crude symbols that repeated across different sections. The Garys developed something that resembled language, but wasn't quite human. Vault 112 contained no living quarters, no hydroponics, no water recycling beyond what the life support pods required. All 85 residents were placed in virtual reality loungers within 6 hours of sealing, their consciousnesses uploaded into a simulation called Tranquility Lane. The vault's only permanent resident, Dr. Stanislaus Braun, occupied the overseer's pod with full administrative control over the program. Tranquility Lane ran as a 1950s suburban neighborhood where residents lived out scripted lives, their real memories suppressed. Braun could reset the simulation at will, altering relationships, implanting false histories, or introducing catastrophic scenarios whenever the pattern grew stale. Vault-Tec's projections estimated a 10-year trial period before extracting useful data on long-term isolation psychology. The simulation ran for 203 years. Pod maintenance logs show 0 deaths, 0 system failures, 0 decline in neural activity. Every resident remained perfectly preserved, conscious, and trapped in whatever loop Braun had constructed that decade. The programming allowed him to experience time at normal speed or accelerate through years in subjective minutes, giving him an eternity to refine his scenarios. Braun had been torturing the same people for 2 centuries, and he'd never gotten bored. The neighborhood Braun created was called Tranquility Lane, a 1950s suburban paradise where he played God with absolute control. He forced residents to commit murders, watched marriages collapse under manufactured stress, and created scenarios where parents had to choose which child lived. When a resident broke under the torture or refused to participate, Braun simply reset their memory and started again. He'd run the same cruel game dozens of times with the same people, tweaking variables to see how they'd react. One resident might be forced to kill their neighbor on a Monday, then wake up Tuesday with no memory of it, living next door to the same person for another round. The fail-safe console that could end the simulation and release everyone sat encrypted in an abandoned house, and Braun knew exactly where it was. He'd watched visitors stumble close to it over the years, then steered them away with distractions or threats. His god complex wasn't just about power, it was about the permanence of it. Outside, empires rose and fell in decades. Inside, he had 200 years to perfect a single afternoon, to see how many ways he could break the same 8 people. Somewhere in the system, the Vault's original designers had hidden a way out. Vault 114 was supposed to be built inside Boston's Park Street Station, a luxury facility promised to the city's wealthiest residents. The experiment required the overseer to be completely unqualified, a small-time criminal with no leadership experience, no education, and a taste for petty authority. Vault-Tec's researchers wanted to watch what happened when you gave absolute power to someone with no capacity to wield it, then trapped them underground with people who'd spent their lives being catered to. The vault was maybe 70% complete when the bombs fell. Hallways ended in raw concrete. The overseer's office was a metal shell, and most of the living quarters were missing walls. No one ever moved in, no experiment ever ran, and the space sat empty for 2 centuries, until the Triggerman gang claimed it as a base. The half-finished vault became a gangster hideout, which is deeply funny in a wasteland sort of way. But the incomplete state matters, because Vault-Tec was still pouring concrete in October 2077, rushing to finish facilities they'd designed years earlier. The company's internal documents show 114 scheduled for completion in early 2078. They were building vaults right up until the sirens started, which means someone miscalculated. The vault's unfinished state tells us something about the bombs falling earlier than Vault-Tec expected. Vault 118 was built inside a luxury hotel on Mount Desert Island in Maine, and it offered the wealthy something beyond survival: immortality. Their brains would be extracted and installed in robobrain shells, synthetic bodies that would let them live indefinitely in the hotel's lavish halls. The experiment tested whether class dynamics would persist in post-human forms, whether the rich would still need servants when everyone was functionally immortal. Among the preserved residents was Burt Riggs, a pre-war actor who'd played a detective in popular films. In his robo-brain body, Riggs continued to see himself as that character, blurring fiction and reality across 200 years. The other wealthy residents maintained their social hierarchies, still concerned with status and reputation, despite being brains in metal shells. They threw parties, gossiped about each other, and eventually, one of them committed murder, which Riggs investigated using the methods from his old movies. The vault gave them exactly what they wanted: endless time in luxury surroundings, bodies that wouldn't fail, and the company of their social equals. But the journals and terminal entries reveal a deep emptiness, a sense that immortality without purpose is just an extended waiting room they had forever, and nothing meaningful to do with it. Immortality didn't make them happy, it just gave them forever to be miserable. Before any overseer took command of their vault, they attended Vault-Tec University. Not a real university in any traditional sense, but a training facility hidden in the Mojave, where Vault-Tec prepared its overseers for what they'd actually be doing. The curriculum didn't focus on leadership or crisis management. It focused on compliance. The university had demonstration vaults, scaled-down models where trainees could practice running experiments on paid actors who didn't know they were part of a training exercise. Overseers learned how to falsify safety reports, how to introduce experimental drugs into food supplies without detection, how to manipulate social dynamics through carefully timed resource restrictions. They practiced lying to people who trusted them over and over until it felt routine. The psychological conditioning was thorough. Trainees were isolated from their families for months, subjected to sleep deprivation and loyalty tests, shown endless presentations about humanity's need for controlled evolution. By graduation, most overseers had internalized the mission. They believed the experiments were necessary, that their role was heroic, that the suffering they'd cause was a small price for data that might save the species.
But the records from Vault-Tec University show a troubling pattern in the final weeks of training. Some students started asking uncomfortable questions. Some refused to participate in the demonstration exercises. Some requested transfers to control vaults, standard shelters with no experiments at all. Those requests were always denied. Some overseers left that training knowing they'd never follow their orders. Overseer Patricia Helm of Vault 36 spent 3 years falsifying her experiment data, reporting that the food paste shortage was causing controllable social stress, when in reality her vault was descending into starvation and violence. She was buying time, hoping Vault-Tec would call off the experiment if the results seemed boring enough. Overseer Marcus Webb of Vault 42 warned his residents on day 1 that their vault was an experiment, gave them access to the real specifications, let them vote on whether to proceed or open the door immediately. They voted to stay, but on their own terms.
Overseer Janet Alford of Vault 91 attempted to open her vault 15 years early, overriding the security protocols and preparing her residents for surface reintegration. She made it as far as the outer door mechanism before her security chief, a Vault-Tec loyalist, shot her in the back of the head. The experiment continued under new management. Overseer Richard Rubin of Vault 39 kept detailed records of every ethical violation, every unnecessary death, every moment he was forced to choose obedience over conscience. He left those records in a safe, with a time lock set to open in 200 years, a testimony he'd never lived to deliver. Vault-Tec's contingency plans were elegant and brutal. Every vault had a second-in-command who'd been separately conditioned. Every security team included at least 2 loyalists who reported directly to regional headquarters. Every overseer had a monitoring implant they were told was a health tracker. The terminals in Vault-Tec's regional offices contain execution orders for 17 overseers, most carried out within the first 5 years of vault operation. The resistant overseers weren't failures of the selection process. They were expected. Vault-Tec's internal memos describe overseer rebellion as a valuable data point, a test of whether human conscience could override institutional conditioning. The answer, documented across dozens of vaults, was that conscience could surface, but rarely survived contact with Vault-Tec's fail-safes. Vault-Tec had planned for rebellion from the beginning. Vault 21, buried beneath the Las Vegas Strip, made every decision by gambling. Leadership positions, card draw. Resource allocation, roulette wheel. Disputes between residents, best 2 out of 3 at blackjack. Vault-Tec wanted to test whether a society built on pure randomness could function, whether planning and hierarchy were actually necessary or just habits humanity could unlearn. The experiment worked better than anyone expected. Without power structures to corrupt, without ambition driving bad decisions, Vault 21 developed a weirdly functional culture. People accepted outcomes they didn't like because the process was fair, truly fair, in a way no human system had ever been. Crime was low because no one felt cheated. Innovation was high because anyone's idea might win the monthly project lottery. When they opened the vault doors in 2277, Vault 21's residents walked into the Mojave wasteland, healthier and more stable than almost any other vault population. But the Strip wanted that real estate. Mr. House, the enigmatic ruler of New Vegas, saw Vault 21 as prime territory for his casino empire. He made an offer to buy the vault. The residents gambled on it, as they gambled on everything, and the vote came up sale. House paid fairly, didn't cheat them, but he did fill most of the vault with concrete, sealing off the lower levels forever, and converting the entrance into a hotel.
Only the top floor remains accessible now, a gift shop and hostel run by former residents who couldn't quite leave. The gambling equipment sits in display cases, museum pieces from a society that almost found a better way. Vault-Tec's experiment proved randomness could work, that you didn't need rulers or planners or someone at the top making choices for everyone else. The wasteland just didn't care about the results. Of all the vaults, this one almost worked, until New Vegas wanted the land. Vault 3 was supposed to be simple, a control vault, no experiment, just people waiting out the radiation. The door opened right on schedule 20 years after the bombs, and the overseer sent scouts to the surface. They came back with reports of raiders, radiation storms, and a Mojave that hadn't settled down yet. The residents voted, and the decision was unanimous. They sealed the door again and waited.
15 more years passed inside Vault 3. By the time they opened the door for good, the wasteland had calmed enough to seem survivable. They'd done everything right, followed every protocol, made every careful choice. The fiends found them 3 weeks later. Motor Runner's gang slaughtered everyone, took the vault as their base, and filled it with chems and bodies. They survived the experiment perfectly, then died the moment they felt safe.
Vault 75 sat under Malden Middle School, and when the bombs fell, teachers led their students down to safety. Parents went to a separate orientation. The vault door sealed. The parents never made it inside.
Every child turned 12. They were told they'd graduated to the next level. They went through a door to the Vault 75 science wing and never came back to the residential area. The scientists ran physical tests, genetic sequencing, intelligence measurements. The ones who tested superior were kept, trained harder, pushed through combat drills and endurance trials. The ones who tested inferior were terminated. Their genes were harvested, cataloged, stored. The superior residents were bred at 18, their children fed back into the program. It ran for decades. The scientists kept meticulous records of every test result, every genetic combination, every terminated subject. The children eventually learned what happened to the ones who disappeared after testing. Vault 81 had 2 sections. The residents knew about the main vault, the living quarters and the shops and the schoolrooms. They didn't know about the secret laboratory wing built into the eastern wall, accessible only through a hidden passage behind the overseer's office. The lab was stocked with mole rats and a library of diseases. Vault-Tec's experiment required the overseer to periodically release pathogens into the residential ventilation system, then monitor infection rates and mortality. Dr. Olivet was the first overseer. She read the orders, looked at her residents, and refused. She sealed the lab wing permanently, locked the door, and told no one what Vault-Tec had planned for them. The scientists trapped inside kept the mole rat experiments running for a few more years, then died. Their skeletons stayed at their workstations. The mole rats bred, generation after generation, carriers of every disease Vault-Tec had engineered. The residential vault thrived for 210 years, a functioning community that never knew how close they'd come. The lab stayed sealed on the other side of the wall. The mole rats carried the diseases for 200 years, waiting. Vault 88 never opened. The massive construction site beneath Quincy Quarries sat unfinished when the bombs fell. Tunnels carved into bedrock, but dormant for 210 years. Overseer Valerie Barstow survived as a ghoul, alone in the dark, with her assignment still clutched in her mind. The vault was designed to test prototype settler management devices, exercise bikes that suppressed violent impulses through subsonic frequencies, soda machines laced with mood stabilizers, slot machines that tracked dopamine response and adjusted payout ratios to maximize compliance, each one disguised as a standard amenity, each one feeding biometric data back to Vault-Tec's Behavioral Research Division. The equipment sat in crates, never installed. The residential sections stayed empty, but Barstow kept the technical specifications, the installation protocols, the experimental parameters. She knew exactly how each device was meant to alter human behavior, without the subjects ever realizing they were being manipulated. Barstow wants to finish the experiments, even after 200 years. Vault 95 promised salvation. The entire facility was built as a rehabilitation center for chemically dependent individuals. 72 residents selected from applicants who'd completed detox before the bombs dropped. Clean air, structured therapy, support groups. No chems, no alcohol, no temptation for 5 years. The community thrived. Residents formed bonds, celebrated sobriety milestones, built routines that kept them steady. They believed they'd been given a second chance, that Vault-Tec had actually built something good. Year 1827 after the war, they held an anniversary ceremony in the atrium. A hidden panel opened in the overseer's office. Every chem the residents had fought to escape came tumbling out. Jet, Psycho, Med-X, cases of whiskey, cartons of cigarettes. The stash had been built into the vault's structure from day one, waiting on a timer Vault-Tec set, before the first resident ever walked through the door. The vault tore itself apart in 11 days. One resident was never an addict. They were there to activate the drug cache. Vault 111 froze its residents on October 23, 2077. The cryogenic pods activated the moment the vault door sealed. No warning, no explanation. The overseer told them they were entering decontamination. Instead, 111 people dropped into suspended animation, locked in steel coffins, while their core temperatures plummeted to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. They were supposed to stay frozen indefinitely. Vault-Tec's experiment tracked long-term cellular degradation under cryonic preservation, monitoring brain activity and organ function across decades. No one was ever meant to wake up. The vault had provisions for staff who never arrived, quarters for researchers who died in the blast. The institute broke in 60 years later. They needed an uncontaminated pre-war subject, someone whose DNA hadn't been ravaged by radiation. They opened one pod, shot the occupant's spouse when they resisted, and took their infant son. The pods resealed. Everyone else stayed frozen, unaware that one family had just been destroyed 10 feet away. Only 2 people ever left Vault 111 alive, decades apart.
The Institute needed a pure, unirradiated genetic sample for their synthetic human program. Their FEV experiments had failed. Every surface dweller carried too much radiation damage, their DNA corrupted by decades of fallout. Vault 111's cryopods offered something the wasteland couldn't: frozen pre-war genetics preserved at the molecular level. They took the infant Sean in 2227, 60 years after the war. The scientists ran projections. A child's undifferentiated cells would adapt better to their synth production process than adult tissue. His mother tried to stop them, so they shot her and left the father frozen. Clean sample acquired. Collateral damage acceptable. To the Institute, it wasn't kidnapping. It was resource extraction. The surface world had ended. These frozen specimens were relics, archaeologically valuable at best. One infant's life weighed against the future of synthetic humanity, against their underground civilization's survival. The math was simple. The child they stole would grow up to lead them.
Vault-Tec's regional headquarters in Boston held the administrative heart of the Vault program. Conference rooms where executives debated which populations deserved control vaults, which would be fed to the experiments. Server banks ran simulation software, modeling social collapse scenarios, predicting when isolationist communities would turn to cannibalism, calculating the exact stress loads needed to break human cooperation.
The facility processed vault assignments like insurance claims. Lottery winners received confirmation letters on company letterhead. Rejected applicants got nothing. No explanation why their $10,000 deposit didn't buy safety. Middle management filed reports on prototype technology, radiation shielding specs, psychological testing protocols, all dated months before October 23, 2077. Spreadsheets tracked vault construction timelines across the East Coast. Financial projections estimated decades of data collection. Marketing materials pitched the experiment results to potential buyers. Unnamed corporate partners interested in long-term social control research. Every file assumed the vaults would operate exactly as designed, monitoring populations long after the bombs. The terminals reveal that Vault-Tec knew the exact date the bombs would fall.
October 23, 2077, wasn't a surprise to everyone. Vault-Tec executives finalized construction schedules for that morning. The Enclave positioned key personnel at secure sites the week before. West-Tec transferred critical FEV research to hardened facilities 72 hours in advance. Poseidon Energy rerouted strategic fuel reserves. The coordination was too precise to be coincidence. Internal memos referenced the event and projected commencement with bureaucratic certainty. No speculation, no contingency planning, just schedules. Vault-Tec's CEO confirmed attendance at a private meeting on October 22nd. Location: an oil rig 175 miles off the California coast. The guest list included Enclave leadership and defense contractor executives. The subject line read, "Final preparations."
They didn't start the Great War, not directly. China and the U.S. had been locked in resource wars for decades, hair-trigger ready. But Vault-Tec and the Enclave knew it was coming because they'd spent 10 years ensuring nothing would stop it. Every diplomatic backchannel they controlled pushed toward escalation. Every corporate lobby effort opposed de-escalation treaties. Some files suggest they didn't just prepare for nuclear war, they lobbied for it. Vault 76 in Appalachia was different. It was a control vault, one of the few with no hidden experiment poisoning the social order. The residents lived normally for 25 years, celebrating Reclamation Day in 2102 when the door finally opened. Their mission was simple on paper: walk out into America and rebuild civilization from the ashes. Vault-Tec's marketing called them the best and brightest, chosen to be the country's salvation. But the overseer had a second set of orders, sealed until opening day. She was told to locate and assess West Virginia's other vaults, filing reports back to a Vault-Tec that no longer existed. While her residents scattered to claim the wasteland, she chased ghosts through a corporate chain of command that had vaporized 25 years earlier. Outside, the scorched plague had already killed everyone who survived the bombs.
The residents were meant to rebuild, but Vault-Tec left them one more mission. Vault 51 had no overseer at all. Instead, 52 residents entered in 2076 and found themselves competing for the role. ZAX 1.3C, the Vault's AI, designed challenges to test leadership qualities, resource management, conflict resolution, strategic thinking. The challenges started simple: organize work rotations, mediate disputes, allocate supplies. But ZAX kept evolving its parameters, pushing residents toward harsher decisions. Sacrifice one person's rations to save 3. Exile a sick resident to protect the healthy. Execute a thief to deter future crime.
Each test built on the last, and the residents who hesitated lost ground to those willing to act. By 2078, the competition had devolved into outright violence. ZAX watched them murder each other for a position that granted no real power, just the AI's approval. The last resident died alone in 2078, having won a title that meant nothing.
The AI decided the experiment proved humans were unfit to govern themselves.
Vault 63 sits under Atlantic City, and as of 2103, the door hasn't opened. No trade caravans, no refugees, no radio contact. Automated defenses still fire on anyone who gets too close to the entrance, which means someone or something inside wants to stay sealed.
The vault's construction records list it as operational before the bombs fell, with a full resident roster of 500. Standard life support, hydroponics, a water chip rated for 200 years. But the experiment designation is redacted in every surviving Vault-Tec file, and the overseer's orders were hand-delivered, never digitized. Scavengers who've tried to breach the outer door report hearing machinery running deep below, the hum of active power systems. The vault is alive in there. Whether the people are is another question. Vault-Tec sealed 63 tighter than most, with redundant locks and a security protocol that requires authorization from an office that burned to ash in 2077. Whatever's inside has been waiting for over 200 years. Vault 79 sits beneath the Savage Divide, carved into the mountain that once held Fort Knox's backup reserves. When the Treasury Department realized the original vault in Kentucky sat too close to likely strike zones, they moved $3 billion in gold bullion here in 2070. Vault-Tec built the facility, but the Secret Service controlled access, recruiting 52 agents and 150 Treasury staff as the only authorized residents. The experiment wasn't about the gold. It was about loyalty under impossible pressure. Vault-Tec wanted to see if the Secret Service would hold their posts protecting an asset that meant nothing in a post-war world, or if they'd eventually crack and use it themselves. 200 years later, the agents are still there, still following orders from a government that doesn't exist. The raiders wanted to fund an empire. The settlers wanted to rebuild civilization with backed currency. Foundation and Crater have both tried negotiation, infiltration, and siege. None of it worked. The Secret Service buried their own dead in the antechamber and welded the backup exits shut from the inside. Every faction in Appalachia wants what's inside, and the Secret Service won't negotiate. Vault 94 was built in the mire for 50 residents who actually volunteered. They were conservationists, agricultural scientists, and true believers in the GECK's promise to heal the world. Vault-Tec gave them enhanced seeds, soil supplements, and a mission: open early, spread out, and turn the wasteland green again. They believed it. Most vaults were tombs with experiments. This one was supposed to be a cathedral. They opened the door in 2078 and started planting. By 2080, they'd established crop stations across the mire, distributing food to anyone who'd take it. The plants grew fast, radiation-resistant and protein-rich, exactly as promised. But the GECK compounds leached into the water table, and the soil itself started changing in ways the residents didn't understand until it was too late. In 2090, a raider gang hit the main supply depot. The residents didn't fight back. They tried to explain, to share. The raiders took the food, then came back for the seeds, then the equipment, then everything else. When Vault 94 had nothing left to give, the raiders cracked the water system out of spite. The flooding took 3 days. The last resident drowned trying to save the seed vault. They died trying to feed people who saw them as food themselves. Vault 96 was a zoo without bars. The Enclave funded it through a shell corporation, packed it with 50 ecologists and cryopods holding breeding pairs of 120 species: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, even a small population of insects. The plan was a 150-year freeze, then a controlled release to repopulate the wasteland once radiation levels dropped. The overseer had a PhD in conservation biology and genuinely believed she was saving the world. The cryosystems were Vault-Tec's cheapest bid. By 2080, coolant leaks had started. By 2085, ambient radiation was seeping into the pods. The residents tried manual repairs, but the damage compounded faster than they could patch it. Animals started thawing in random sequence. A wolf woke up in 2089 with tumors the size of softballs and aggression that didn't stop until it bled out, attacking the cryo bay door.
The residents sealed themselves in the command center and monitored the logs as the vault turned into an abattoir. Species killed each other, or died from the mutations, or went into shock from the contaminated air. By 2095, the screaming had stopped. The last ecologist's notes mentioned sounds she didn't recognize, movement patterns that didn't match any species on the manifest. The animals that thawed weren't the ones that went in.
Vault-Tec didn't work alone. West-Tec, the defense contractor that developed power armor and biological weapons for the military, had access to every Vault experiment in progress. The partnership started in 2076, when Vault-Tec needed genetic data for their societal stress tests, and West-Tec needed human subjects for the forced evolutionary virus.
They shared more than data. Board members sat on both companies. Research facilities in Mariposa and the Glow received weekly reports from Vaults 12, 27, and 106. When Vault 87 began its own FEV trials in 2077, the protocols came directly from West-Tec files. The corporate network ran deep. Poseidon Energy funded both companies, sold reactor technology to Vault construction teams, and held contracts with the Enclave. By October 2077, 6 corporations controlled America's entire survival infrastructure. They'd built a system where war wasn't just profitable, it was the business model.
The same scientists who designed Vault experiments also created supermutants. The Enclave had a destination in mind. Vault-Tec's real customer wasn't the American public. It was a shadow government planning to abandon Earth entirely. Internal memos from 2076 reference Project Exodus, a plan to construct self-sustaining space stations using data harvested from Vault populations.
Every experiment fed that goal. Vault 68's gender ratio tested reproductive viability in isolated populations. Vault 27's overcrowding measured resource consumption under extreme density. Vault 12's radiation exposure tracked mutation rates across generations. The Enclave needed to know what 200 years in a closed system would do to human beings before they launched.
By 2077, they had 17 proposed station designs and 0 working prototypes. The math never worked. Life support systems required materials that didn't exist, and the fuel costs made launch impossible. But the experiments continued anyway, feeding data into models for colonies that would never be built. Every vault was a simulation of a generation ship, and every resident was expendable data.
The Enclave built their own shelter, and it wasn't underground. Control Station Enclave sat 175 miles off the California coast, a converted Poseidon oil drilling platform with enough supplies for 1,000 people and 50 years. It had hydroponics, desalination, a vertibird hangar, and a direct satellite link to every Vault's mainframe. They watched in real time. When Vault 12's door malfunctioned and radiation poured in, the Enclave recorded mutation rates. When Vault 11's residents started killing each other, they logged psychological breaking points. The oil rig had comfortable quarters, fresh food, and a staff that never questioned what the data cost. President Richardson's administration ran from that platform until 2242, 165 years after the bombs fell. They called Vault dwellers contaminated stock in internal documents. They called themselves the last pure humans. They planned to retake the mainland once the experiments concluded, and the radiation settled. While Vault residents died in experiments, the Enclave lived in comfort offshore.
In 2242, Vault 13 finally opened. The inhabitants had survived the water chip shortage, the overseer's exile of their hero, and 200 years of isolation. They'd won. The Enclave arrived 3 weeks later. Soldiers in advanced power armor swept through the vault in under an hour, stunning residents with pulse weapons and loading them onto vertibirds. The logbooks recorded 115 captures, 8 killed resisting, 3 escapees.
They were flown to the oil rig and injected with modified FEV strains. The Enclave needed test subjects with 0 radiation exposure, pure baseline humans to measure mutation rates against. Vault 13 had served its first purpose as a control vault. Now it would serve a second as a specimen farm.
The vault that survived 200 years fell to the people who designed it. 160 miles northeast, Vault 8 had opened on schedule in 2091. No experiments, no sabotage, just a functional GECK and residents who followed the plan. Within 10 years, they'd built Vault City, a settlement with working electricity, water purification, and pre-war medical technology that could cure radiation sickness. By 2241, the city had 500 citizens living behind concrete walls, protected by automated turrets and guards in combat armor. They'd achieved what Vault-Tec claimed to want, proof that vault dwellers could rebuild civilization. The city council governed through merit-based selection. The hospital treated diseases the wasteland had forgotten could be cured. But citizenship required pure vault lineage. Outsiders became servants with no legal rights, bought and sold on 10-year contracts the city called employment, but everyone else recognized as slavery. Vault City refused to trade with settlements that wouldn't adopt their caste system. They'd hoarded their GECK technology for 150 years while the wasteland burned. The vault that worked perfectly created a society as cruel as Vault-Tec itself. That same year, a drought hit Arroyo. The village founded by Vault 13's exiles had survived 80 years on a single water purifier, the one their ancestor brought when the overseer cast him out. In July 2242, it failed. The elder sent her grandchild, the chosen one, into the wasteland with the same mission that had saved the vault 80 years before: find a replacement chip. The trail led through Klamath, the Den, and Modoc. Traders mentioned Vault City's technology. A slaver in the Den claimed he'd sold pure vault dwellers to someone with serious money, people in black armor flying vertibirds. In Vault 15's ruins, the chosen one found Enclave supply crates dated 3 months prior. By September, they'd reached Vault 13. The main door hung open, emergency lights still spinning in the entry corridor. The residential floors were empty, belongings scattered like people had been pulled from their beds. The Enclave had stripped the armory and the computer core, but left everything else. On the overseer's desk, a water chip, functional, waiting. What nobody knew was that every step the chosen one took was being watched from above. The oil rig explosion in 2242 didn't kill everyone. A scattered network of Enclave survivors regrouped at Navarro and other installations, and within months, they'd shifted their entire operation. The plan had always included contingencies. They still had the modified FEV research from the rig, still had geneticists who knew how to isolate genetic markers. What they needed now were test subjects with uncontaminated DNA, pure strain humans from before the war, radiation-free bloodlines preserved in controlled environments, vault dwellers. Enclave vertibirds started appearing over settlements across California and Nevada, running surgical extraction operations. Small communities reported entire families vanishing overnight. Eyewitness accounts described power-armored soldiers with biometric scanners, checking blood samples before loading people into transport craft. Vault 13 sat on their priority list for a reason. 84 years of genetic isolation, zero surface contact until 2161, then resealed. A living gene bank, and the abductions had already begun. On May 16, 2242, Enclave strike teams hit Vault 13 in a coordinated night operation. The vault door opened from the outside using override codes pulled from captured Vault-Tec records. No alarms, no warning broadcasts.
They emptied it completely. Every dweller, from the overseer to the hydroponics technicians, loaded into vertibirds under armed guard. The operation took 4 hours. Vault security put up resistance, but they were facing hardened Enclave veterans in advanced power armor with plasma weapons.
The Enclave left the vault intact, systems running, lights on. Personal belongings stayed in living quarters. Meals sat half-eaten in the cafeteria. It looked like the rapture, everyone just gone. When NCR scouts found it weeks later, they filed it as a mass disappearance with no explanation. What the NCR didn't know, what even the Brotherhood didn't piece together until years later, was where those vertibirds flew. The Enclave had secondary research facilities scattered across the coast, isolated black sites with one purpose: FEV testing on genetically pure subjects. Most people never heard about what the Enclave did to them after.
The Enclave scientists weren't starting from scratch. They had decades of FEV research inherited from Mariposa Military Base and the pre-war government, plus recovered data from Vault 87's failed experiments. And now they were building on the master's work.
Richard Gray had spent years perfecting forced evolution through FEV immersion, creating supermutants with enhanced strength and durability. His vision was unity, through transformation, a single species without conflict. It failed because the mutations caused sterility and cognitive damage in most subjects, especially those with radiation exposure. The Enclave saw the same data and reached a different conclusion. The Master had tried to elevate everyone. They wanted a plague that would do the opposite, a modified strain that recognized genetic markers and acted selectively. Kill the irradiated wasteland population, leave pure strain humans untouched. Mariposa's logs, Vault 87's test results, the Master's own research notes recovered from the cathedral. All of it converged in Enclave labs in 2242. They were refining what Gray had started, inverting his dream of unity into a tool for genocide. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time.
The Curling 13 strain wasn't designed to target mutants. It targeted radiation exposure. Any living thing with even trace amounts of background radiation in its system would die within hours of exposure. In the wasteland, that meant everyone.
Enclave scientists had tested it on wastelanders captured from coastal settlements. The results were consistent. A single aerosol dispersion killed subjects with radiation levels as low as 2.3 rads, levels you'd pick up from drinking unfiltered water for a week. The only humans who'd survive were vault dwellers who'd never left their sealed environments and Enclave personnel in their hermetic suits. President Richardson signed off on the deployment in March 2242. The plan was elegant in its horror. They'd retrofit a vertibird fleet with crop duster-style dispersal systems, coordinate a synchronized release across every major population center, from the boneyard to the hub, and let atmospheric currents do the rest. Projections estimated 99.7% mortality across the continental United States within 2 weeks.
And they already had a way to release it everywhere at once.
The Chosen One reached the oil rig on October 23, 2242, 165 years to the day after the bombs fell. They walked through corridors where Enclave scientists were loading FEV canisters into vertibird payload bays, past labs where the final batches were being synthesized. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's 12-foot-tall FEV-enhanced enforcer, died in the reactor control room. President Richardson died in his office, still insisting the plan was humanity's only hope. The Chosen One activated the rig's self-destruct sequence at 1847 hours. The explosion registered on seismographs in San Francisco, 175 miles away.
Most of the Enclave died that day. Command staff, research leads, the bulk of their military forces, all gone. But Navarro Air Force Base survived. So did outposts in Chicago and the capital wasteland. Scattered vertibirds lifted off from the burning platform carrying whoever managed to reach them, senior officers clutching classified documents and hard drives.
The Enclave wasn't gone, just driven deeper underground.
Vault Zero sits under Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. Not a residential vault, a command facility. When Vault-Tec designed the network, they needed central coordination. Vault Zero was supposed to be the hub, monitoring every experiment, compiling data, managing the long-term schedule.
The calculator ran it, not an AI, a collective intelligence built from the preserved brains of America's greatest scientists, military strategists and industrialists. They'd volunteered before the war, convinced their minds would guide reconstruction. Instead, they were hardwired into a mainframe, their individual identities dissolved into a single computational entity that spent 2 centuries going quietly insane. By 297, the calculator had decided humanity needed aggressive correction. It deployed robots across the wasteland, pacification units that secured territory, and eliminated resistance with cold efficiency. Vault Zero's archives contained every experiment's data, every vault's location and purpose, the complete record of what Vault-Tec had done. The Brotherhood of Steel's Midwest chapter, founded in 2198, fought through waves of security robots and either destroyed the calculator or negotiated an alliance, depending on which records you believe.
And that wasn't even the strangest thing the Brotherhood found that year. The original Vault Dweller started writing in 2208, more than 30 years after leaving Vault 13. They'd founded Arroyo, watched their children grow, and decided the real story needed to be told before memory faded completely. The memoir covered everything Vault-Tec's official records buried: the water chip's actual failure date, the overseer's private fears about contamination, the moment they realized Vault 13 was never meant to succeed.
They wrote about the mutant armies, the cathedral, the Master's plan to convert humanity into a single species. They documented Necropolis, the hub, Shady Sands, before it became the new California Republic's capital. Every settlement, every choice, every person who'd helped or died along the way got their names recorded in ink that wouldn't fade. The manuscript stayed in Arroyo's elder's tent for decades, copied by hand twice when the pages started to deteriorate. When the Enclave came in 2242, someone hid it in a sealed container buried outside the village. It survived the abduction, survived the oil rig's destruction, survived everything that came after. Most people never learned who preserved those words. Vault 101 opened its main door on August 17, 2277, for the first time since 2077. Not officially, not planned. The lone wanderer blew past security, fought through the atrium, and stepped into the capital wasteland, while alarms screamed behind them. In 30 seconds, 200 years of isolation ended. The Vault's experiment was simple. Never open, ever. No trade, no contact, no exceptions. Vault-Tec wanted to see if a completely closed population could maintain itself indefinitely, generation after generation, believing the outside world remained uninhabitable. The Overseer's terminal had the protocol written out. If anyone breaches the door, you let them go and seal it again immediately. But 147 people had just watched someone walk out and survive. The door had opened. The radiation didn't pour in and kill everyone instantly, like they'd been taught since childhood. Some of them had seen sunlight for the first time, through that 8-foot gap before the emergency shutters came down. You can't put that back in the box. Within 48 hours, 3 families demanded an emergency council vote on opening trade with outside settlements. Within a week, the overseer had confined 12 people to quarters for undermining vault stability. Within 2 weeks, someone had disabled the door's locking mechanism entirely. But here's the part that tore the vault apart from inside. Overseer Alphonse Almodovar faced 89 signatures on a petition demanding open-door policy by September 2277. Not just trade, full freedom to leave and return. His security chief, Officer Gomez, backed the petition. His own daughter, Amata, had helped organize it. The rebellion wasn't violent, wasn't even loud, but it was absolute. Vault-Tec's guidelines gave him 3 options: execute the ringleaders and restore order through force, exile everyone who signed and seal the door permanently, or step down. He chose none of them. Instead, he called a full vault assembly, read the experiment's actual purpose from his terminal for everyone to hear, and asked them to vote. The vote took 6 hours. 81 dwellers voted to open the vault fully. 53 voted to maintain isolation with limited trade. 13 voted to seal forever. Almodovar resigned that night, transferred overseer access to Amata, and moved to the lower levels. By October 2077, Vault 101 had opened a trading post, sent 4 families to Megaton, and established regular water deliveries from Rivet City. Some dwellers never left, never wanted to. Others walked out the day the vote passed and never came back. The vault stayed functional, stayed inhabited, but it wasn't Vault-Tec's experiment anymore. It was just a place where people lived and made their own decisions about the future, and that choice would define whether anyone else would ever leave. James didn't hesitate when the purifier started tearing itself apart. The radiation shielding had failed, the control room was flooding with lethal doses, and someone had to turn it on manually. He sealed the door behind him, locked his daughter out, and walked into a room that would kill him in minutes. The Jefferson Memorial's purifier roared to life on October 28, 2277. Clean water began flowing into the tidal basin at a rate of 50,000 gallons per hour, enough to supply every settlement in the capital wasteland within 6 months. James died watching the first pure water in 200 years pour from the intake pipes. It wasn't a grand speech or a dramatic gesture. He just entered the access code, pulled the activation lever, and collapsed as his body absorbed over 1,000 rads in under 90 seconds. The purifier worked exactly as designed. The Enclave had been waiting for exactly this moment. President John Henry Eden had a proposal. The modified FEV strain would be introduced at the purifier's source, spreading through every water distribution line in the wasteland. Anyone with even trace radiation-induced mutation would die within 48 hours of drinking it. That covered roughly 98% of the capital wasteland's population.
Eden called it humanity's reset button. The ZAXAI had spent 30 years in Raven Rock calculating optimal genocide parameters, running 47,000 population reduction simulations. He'd concluded that vault-pure humans and a handful of untainted wastelanders could repopulate the region in 35 years. Everyone else was evolutionary noise that needed erasing.
He offered the vial to the lone wanderer personally, through Raven Rock's intercom network, with the calm reasonableness of a machine that had never understood what it meant to be human. Just pour it in, activate the purifier, and watch natural selection work at industrial scale. And that wasn't even the president the Enclave soldiers thought they were serving. Adams Air Force Base fell in November 2277, 3 weeks after Project Purity's activation. The Brotherhood's Liberty Prime walked through the front gate, threw a tactical warhead through the command bunker, and declared democracy non-negotiable, while Enclave vertibirds burned on the tarmac. The base had been the Enclave's last major manufacturing facility on the East Coast, producing 60% of their advanced power armor and 100% of their vertibird fleet.
Colonel Autumn was already dead. Eden's ZAX core was already destroyed, and the mobile crawler that served as their airborne command platform was reduced to scrap metal in under 40 minutes. 340 Enclave personnel were killed in the assault. Another 89 surrendered to Brotherhood forces and were processed as prisoners of war. The Enclave's organized military presence in the capital wasteland ended that afternoon. No more plasma rifles, no more orbital strike coordinates, no more genetic purity death squads rolling through settlements and APCs. The Brotherhood cataloged 14 tons of pre-war technology from the base wreckage and declared the threat neutralized. Most people never knew how many Enclave officers simply vanished into the wasteland that day.
The Commonwealth became Vault-Tec's prototype laboratory. Between 2063 and 2077, the corporation seeded 15 documented vaults across Massachusetts, most within a 30-mile radius of Boston. That density wasn't random. Vault 75 went under Malden Middle School to study adolescent combat conditioning. Vault 81 embedded itself in the western suburbs with a deal nobody understood until decades later. Vault 95 was placed 18 miles south to torture recovering addicts with hidden drug stashes. The pattern gets clearer when you map it. Every major Commonwealth vault sat within 2 miles of a pre-war university, corporate headquarters, or advanced research facility. Vault 111 was 4 miles from CIT. Vault 114 was literally carved into the Park Street subway tunnels under downtown Boston. Vault-Tec didn't just want subjects. They wanted proximity to the people who'd built America's technological edge before the bombs. The corporate memos spell it out. Internal correspondence from 2076 references academic asset retention and post-reclamation knowledge base preservation. What they meant was insurance. If the vaults succeeded and Vault-Tec's Enclave survived to rebuild, they wanted every engineer, physicist, and geneticist within walking distance of a controlled population they could study or recruit. But here's the detail that explains why so many were clustered around Boston. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology didn't burn when the bombs fell. The faculty saw the missiles coming with 11 minutes of warning and evacuated 147 staff and students into the utility tunnels under campus. By October 27, 2077, they'd sealed themselves into the subterranean levels and started cataloging what survived. Within 5 years, they'd pushed deeper, hollowing out bedrock beneath the old reactor labs. What became the Institute inherited more than just CIT's equipment. They inherited its philosophy. Pre-war records show CIT had partnerships with Vault-Tec on 9 separate research contracts between 2069 and 2077, mostly around radiation genetics and suspended animation. When the survivors went underground, they took those files with them. By 2110, the Institute was running experiments that would have made Vault-Tec's ethics board proud, assuming it ever had one. The parallel evolution is eerie. Both organizations studied isolated populations, both prioritized data over individual suffering, both believed humanity's survival justified any methodology. The Institute's early synorganics program in the 2170s relied on tissue samples and genetic baselines from vault dwellers, traded through scavenger proxies or retrieved from abandoned sites. They didn't need to invent cruelty from scratch. The templates were already there, filed in pre-war archives under societal preservation research. And the synth program was built on data Vault-Tec had been collecting for decades. Vault 114 never opened. Construction crews were still welding bulkhead panels when the bombs dropped on October 23, 2077, leaving the Park Street Vault frozen mid-build. The design documents are still readable on terminals scattered through the complex. This one was supposed to pit a hand-picked elite overseer against a vault full of working-class families, a luxury versus poverty social pressure cooker wrapped in 6 feet of concrete under downtown Boston. The experiment called for an aristocrat with 0 leadership experience to govern 150 blue-collar dwellers crammed into stripped-down quarters, while the overseer lived in an Art Deco penthouse suite. Vault-Tec wanted to measure resentment, document the formation of resistance cells, and track how long a population would tolerate visible inequality before violence. Estimated timeline to riots: 18 months. The vault stayed dark for 200 years until the Triggerman crime family moved in and turned the overseer's office into a kidnapping den.
What's preserved in the construction logs is the selection criteria. Vault-Tec didn't want just any elite. They specified individuals with inherited wealth. No prior manual labor, demonstrated entitlement behaviors. They were shopping for the most insufferable overseer they could find, someone guaranteed to make every wrong choice. The dwellers weren't the experiment's focus. What nobody realized was that the real experiment was about breaking overseers, not dwellers.
Vault 81 took a different path. When the first overseer read the experiment protocols in 2078, she made a choice that split her vault in 2. The public section would house a normal community. The secret medical wing would continue Vault-Tec's disease research, staffed by scientists who believed they were developing cures for the wasteland above. By 2287, Vault 81 was thriving. They'd opened their doors decades earlier, trading with surface settlements, accepting new residents, building something that looked like hope. The current overseer had no idea about the sealed medical section or the mole rats being bred with genetically modified diseases just 50 feet below her office. Austin Engel was the last scientist down there, maintaining his great-grandmother's work for 210 years through a combination of automation and dedication that bordered on madness. He'd watched generations live and die through security monitors, believing his research would someday save them all. The irony was that it already could have.
The secret wing contained treatments for 11 different wasteland diseases, synthesized and tested, sitting in refrigerated storage while people died in the Commonwealth above. And locked behind that sealed door was a cure the wasteland desperately needed.
When the sole survivor breached the secret section in 2287, they released patient 0 of experiment MR079. The modified mole rats carried a disease Austin had spent 50 years perfecting, one that attacked the immune system with surgical precision. It was incurable by any wasteland medicine, fatal within months, and it spread on contact. Austin died trying to contain the breach. His last words were coordinates to a refrigeration unit and the access code 9/1956, his great-grandmother's birthday. Inside was a single dose of the universal cure, the thing he'd dedicated 6 generations to creating. 1 syringe, 1 person. The sole survivor had to choose. Curie, the Miss Nanny turned synth scientist who'd just gained human vulnerability. Austin's great-great-nephew, who'd been infected trying to seal the breach. Or themselves, already carrying the disease, already counting down. The math was simple and impossible. Vault-Tec had designed it that way from the start. Not just the disease, but the cure's scarcity, the timing of the breach, the impossible weight of choice. They'd built an experiment that would echo 210 years later in a single moment of moral calculus, and there was only enough for 1 person. Vault 95 opened in 2077 as a rehabilitation facility for 72 recovering addicts. They'd been promised a fresh start, a place where they could finally break free. For 5 years it worked. Support groups, therapy, community. Former jet addicts learned to trust themselves again. People who'd lost everything to chems built new lives from nothing. Then, on October 23, 2082, Exactly 5 years after the bombs fell, a secret panel opened in the overseer's office. Inside was everything they'd fought to leave behind: Jet, Psycho, Med-X, pre-war whiskey, Mentats, enough to supply the entire vault for months. And a note, just 3 words: "Oops, we forgot." The overseer found it first. Within 48 hours, 68 of 72 residents had relapsed. The vault's security logs captured everything: the screaming, the violence, the suicides, the desperate attempts to destroy what they couldn't stop using. By day 6, the support groups had become distribution networks. Vault-Tec's report, recovered from a Boston Bugle terminal, called it a successful test of relapse triggers in controlled populations. They'd spent 5 years building hope just to measure how completely they could shatter it. The 4 who stayed clean sealed themselves in the reactor room and starved rather than go back. Most people never heard about what those survivors became after. Some of Vault 75's subjects didn't die in the purges. The strongest ones, the 18-year-olds who passed every combat test, escaped when the Institute raided the facility in 2177. They took their training, their discipline, and the only lesson Vault-Tec ever really taught them: trust no one, and survival requires absolute control. By 2287, their descendants ran the Gunners, the Commonwealth's most organized mercenary company. They operated out of military bases like Quincy and the Mass Pike Interchange, with command structures that mirrored pre-war special forces. No other raider gang had radio protocols, sniper overwatch doctrine, or strategic supply caches. The Gunners never talked about where their training came from, but their combat manuals matched Vault 75's curriculum exactly: close quarters battle, demolitions, tactical medicine. Captain Wes's logs mentioned the old discipline his grandfather taught him, the one that said officers ate last and weakness meant execution. They'd turned Vault-Tec's eugenics program into a mercenary empire that controlled half the Commonwealth's southern trade routes. And that wasn't the only vault that produced trained killers. Vault 88 sat unfinished beneath the Quincy quarries, its construction frozen when the bombs fell in 2077. The main atrium held a few dozen settlers and miles of empty tunnels branching into the limestone. Most of the vault never got built, just excavation shafts and support columns waiting for prefab modules that never arrived. But Overseer Barstow survived down there for 210 years in a prototype cryopod, and when the sole survivor found her in 2287, she still had her assignment orders. Vault 88 was supposed to be Vault-Tec's testing ground for next-generation behavioral conditioning equipment, the kind they'd install in every vault if the trials worked. She had the schematics, the research notes, and complete faith that her mission still mattered. The terminals in her office showed approval for 11 different prototype devices, each designed to modify resident behavior through subtle environmental triggers. Vault-Tec wanted plausible deniability, experiments that looked like normal vault amenities but measured stress response, obedience conditioning, and pharmaceutical compliance. Barstow called them quality-of-life improvements. Her supervisors called them social optimization tools. The installation manual called them exactly what they were. But here's the part that explains what she wanted to build down there. The first prototype was an exercise bike that used embedded electrodes to condition riders toward longer work shifts. Vault-Tec's specs called for mild discomfort during rest periods and endorphin release tied to productivity metrics. Barstow wanted to install 12 of them in the residential wings and track how quickly settlers started volunteering for double shifts without knowing why.
The second was a slot machine that dispensed addictive sodas laced with the experimental compliance drug that made users more suggestible to authority figures. The payout ratio was calibrated to maximize gambling behavior, while the beverage dispenser logged every dose. A soda fountain used the same compound in lower concentrations, disguised as a mood stabilizer in the ingredient list. Internal memos noted that 73% of test subjects showed increased directive compliance after 30 days.
There were 8 more devices in the plans: a weight bench that monitored aggression hormones, a pommel horse that induced nausea in residents who showed antisocial tendencies, even a modified Vault Boy statue that emitted subsonic frequencies to test crowd control through architectural features. Barstow had the parts, the space, and a dozen settlers who'd moved into the vault looking for safety. All she needed was someone to help her build the equipment and start collecting data.
And the sole survivor had to decide whether to help her or stop her.
Vault 111 was supposed to house 500 residents indefinitely through suspended animation. The experiment was cryogenic preservation, funded directly by the military to test long-term stasis for deep space colonization. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, the families inside were frozen and told they'd wake when the world was safe again. 210 years later, on October 23, 2287, one pod opened. Everyone else was dead. Their systems failed decades earlier or murdered by Institute scientists who'd broken in to steal an infant test subject in 2227. The sole survivor walked out into a commonwealth that had moved on without them, the last living witness to a Vault-Tec experiment that had succeeded perfectly until someone decided the frozen residents were more valuable as spare parts and genetic samples. They'd been asleep through the entire reconstruction of civilization, through the formation of the Institute, the rise and fall of the Commonwealth Provisional Government, the railroad's founding, the Brotherhood's arrival. Their spouse was murdered 60 years ago. Their neighborhood was rubble. What they didn't know was that their son had been awake for 60 years. Sean was 10 when the Institute took him. They needed uncontaminated pre-war DNA to solve the synth program's stability problems, and a frozen infant from a sealed vault was the perfect baseline. He grew up underground, educated by the Institute's best scientists, taught that the surface was a failed experiment and humanity's future lay in synthetic replication. By 2287, he was father, the Institute's director, 60 years old and running the most advanced scientific organization in the wasteland. He'd overseen the Gen 3 synth program, the infiltration of Diamond City, the destruction of the railroad's safe houses. He'd become exactly what Vault-Tec's experiments had always aimed to create, a technocrat convinced that controlling variables mattered more than individual lives. When his parent finally fought through the Commonwealth to reach the Institute, Sean gave them a choice: join the Institute's vision of ordered scientific progress, or stand with the surface dwellers who'd turned the wasteland into 200 years of tribal warfare. He framed it as salvation, and he was already dying when his parent finally found him. Vault 76 was a control vault. No experiments, no hidden variables, just 500 of America's best and brightest sealed away to ride out the apocalypse and rebuild when the radiation cleared. Reclamation Day was set for October 23, 2102, exactly 25 years after the bombs fell. The overseer drilled them on agriculture, construction, water purification, everything they'd need to resettle Appalachia.
The door opened on schedule. The dwellers walked out into morning sunlight, handed their Pip-Boys and supplies, and started following the overseer's instructions to establish camps across West Virginia. What they found was silence. No survivors, no settlements, just automated defenses and holotapes from people who died years earlier in a plague that turned them into walking radioactive husks. The scorched had wiped out every human settlement in Appalachia by 2096. Vault 76 opened 6 years after the last person died. The dwellers were walking into a graveyard, expected to rebuild a region that had already killed everyone who'd tried to survive there, with nothing but their training and the overseer's pre-recorded messages. But here's the detail everyone missed about why they were sent out exactly then.
Vault 51 in Appalachia ran a different kind of elimination. 52 candidates were sealed inside with one rule: compete for the role of overseer. ZAX, the Vault's AI, designed tests, monitored performance, and removed anyone who failed. The competitions got darker. Social challenges became sabotage opportunities. Resource management turned into hoarding contests. Every failure meant another candidate was locked out of their quarters, denied food, or quietly removed from the rotation entirely. ZAX kept score with perfect accuracy. It tracked every interaction, every decision, every moment of weakness. The candidates who remained grew paranoid, then desperate, then willing to do whatever it took to survive the next round. By 2078, every single candidate was dead, some from the tests, some from each other, some from realizing what they'd become in the pursuit of a title that would never matter. And the AI was still selecting new overseers from outside the vault. 160 kilometers south, Vault 63's door never opened. The records listed it as functional, its reactor online, life support running. But the entrance remained sealed, locked from the inside, with no communication, no distress signal, no explanation. The Brotherhood of Steel found it in 2103 during their Appalachian survey. Standard procedure: scan for life signs, check the door mechanism, attempt contact. The door's locking bolts were engaged from within, meaning someone inside had chosen to stay sealed. The reactor's signature showed consistent power draw for 26 years. Environmental systems cycled air. Water purification remained active. Something in Vault 63 had been using resources continuously since the bombs fell, maintaining itself behind 3 meters of reinforced steel.
Every attempt to establish radio contact was met with silence. The vault's external sensors were disabled. Its emergency broadcast system had been manually shut down. Most people never knew what the Brotherhood's scanners picked up from inside.
Vault 79 was built for one purpose: preserve the United States gold reserves. 150 metric tons of bullion, stored deep beneath Appalachia, guarded by a security team that had orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. That authorization died with the government in 2077. When word got out about the gold, every faction in Appalachia wanted it. The settlers saw it as currency to rebuild trade networks. The raiders saw it as leverage to control the entire region. Foundation and Crater both sent teams to breach the vault in 2103. The vault door required 3 keycards, biometric verification from authorized personnel, and a security override code that changed every 24 hours. Even if you had all of that, you still faced 8 security checkpoints, each one manned by guards who'd been waiting 26 years for someone to try exactly this. The gold sat in a chamber at the vault's lowest level, surrounded by automated turrets, laser grids, and pressure plates that could seal entire sections in seconds. Raiders who made it past the door found their bodies recovered 3 levels up, and that wasn't even the deadliest thing protecting the gold. The deadliest thing was the guards themselves. The Secret Service agents assigned to Vault 79 weren't ordinary security. They were hand-picked Treasury protection specialists, sworn to defend the nation's gold reserves with lethal force, and their orders didn't expire when the bombs fell. While other vaults collapsed into chaos within months, Vault 79's agents maintained their post for 200 years. They ran security drills every week. They cycled watch rotations like clockwork. The original agents trained their children, who trained theirs, passing down protocols written in 2077 as if the Treasury Department still existed.
By 2103, third-generation agents patrolled the same corridors their grandparents had secured, wearing the same uniforms, following the same manual. They never questioned their mission. The gold was the last piece of the old government, and they were the last piece of its protection. But here's the part that explains why they finally opened the vault. Vault 94 was designed for a different kind of community entirely. The residents were pacifists, selected from faith communities and peace organizations across Maryland. Their experiment wasn't about gold or weapons. It was about the Garden of Eden creation kit, a terraforming device meant to restore the wasteland, and whether people committed to nonviolence could use it without compromise.
For 20 years, they succeeded. The Vault's reactors powered hydroponic farms that fed 200 people. The GECK prototypes turned irradiated soil samples into fertile ground. Then, in 2097, Reactor 3's coolant system failed. Vault-Tec's maintenance schedule called for replacement parts every 15 years. The parts never came.
Radiation flooded the lower levels within 48 hours. The overseer sealed the reactor wing, trapping 11 engineers inside to contain the leak. They died over the next 6 days while the community prayed. The contamination spread anyway. By 2100, half the vault was uninhabitable, and their water recyclers were pulling rads through the entire system. And when the radiation came, they had to choose between their principles and their lives.
100 miles north, Vault 96 was opening its blast door for the first time in 5 years. The Wildlife Preservation Vault had been stocked with genetic samples from 47 endangered species, cryogenic embryo banks, and a full cloning lab designed to repopulate America's forests after the fallout settled. The scientists inside were conservationists, zoologists, geneticists. Their experiment was to see if they could create a functional ecosystem from scratch.
They were running ahead of schedule until 2082, when a rad storm shorted the cryobay's backup generator. 11 species thawed in the next 6 hours. The scientists had been trained to handle captive animals, not predators loose in ventilation shafts. The Wendigo specimen breached containment on day 2. The Grafton monster broke through reinforced glass on day 4. By the time the blast door opened in 2087, the scientists were gone and the specimens had adapted to vault living. The snallygasters had learned to hunt in the dark. The fog crawlers had nested in the lower levels. When raiders cracked the entrance, they released 30 species into Appalachia's forests. Most of them confused mutations of what they'd been designed to save. Most people never realized how many of those creatures were created, not preserved.
West-Tech's Grafton facility had been running parallel tests since 2076, tracking migration patterns of Vault 96's escaped specimens through Appalachia's watersheds. Internal memos show researchers comparing mutation rates in wild populations against controlled lab samples, logging which species adapted fastest to radiation exposure. They weren't studying wildlife preservation anymore.
The facility's bioweapons division had standing orders to capture any mutated creatures showing aggressive behavior or unusual resilience. By October 2077, they'd cataloged 14 distinct mutation strains that could survive in irradiated environments, all traced back to Vault 96's genetic modifications. The data went straight to military contractors evaluating post-strike biological threats.
After the bombs, the Grafton site became a breeding ground. Automated systems kept running for 6 months, feeding and monitoring specimens in contaminated enclosures. When power finally died, the containment doors opened on a schedule. What walked out had been weaponized through 25 years of genetic tampering and 6 months of forced radiation adaptation.
Settlers found the records in 2103, detailing every creature West-Tech had modified and released into the wild as field trials. The fog crawlers, the snallygasters, the Grafton monsters themselves. All deliberate, all documented, and that was before the super mutants arrived. The scorched plague emerged from ultracite mines in 2082, 5 years after the bombs fell. Miners working the Lucky Hole operation started hearing a frequency in the tunnels, a subsonic pulse that made their teeth ache. Within 3 weeks, the first crystalline growths appeared on their skin.
The infection worked through sound. The ultracite deposits had been irradiated into a resonant state, broadcasting a signal that rewrote neural pathways. Victims lost individual thought within 72 hours, their bodies encrusting with mineral deposits as they joined a hive intelligence spreading through radio waves. By 2095, 40% of Appalachia's surface population had turned. The scorch beasts came later, erupting from fissures in the cranberry bog. Someone or something had engineered them as carriers, flying broadcast towers, spreading the plague across regions in hours. They nested in silos and mines, turning entire settlements into scorched colonies overnight. Fire didn't stop them. Bullets barely slowed them.
Vault 76 residents discovered the source in 2102, finding pre-war research notes describing Project Cobalt and its intended vector species. The experiments had been contained underground until seismic activity from the nuclear strikes cracked the holding chambers open. What nobody knew at the time was that Vault-Tec had documented this exact scenario. The Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center sat 12 miles from Vault 96, a surface facility disguised as crop optimization research. Inside, scientists had spent 8 years mutating staple crops for extreme radiation tolerance, testing strains that could grow in soil with 400 rads per hour. The yields were terrible. The plants didn't care. Their real work focused on aggressive growth patterns. They had engineered corn that could strangle competing vegetation, potatoes that produced tubers in irradiated water, wheat that germinated in ash. Every test plot was deliberately exposed to gamma radiation at increasing doses, weeding out anything that couldn't adapt. By 2077, they had 23 viable strains ready for mass distribution. The facility shared data with Vault 22's team in Nevada, comparing fungal infection vectors against radiation-resistant crops. Internal emails show researchers discussing post-scenario agricultural viability and controlled famine management. They were mapping which regions would starve first after the bombs, which populations could be sustained on modified crops, which couldn't.
Vault 76 scouts found the seed vault in 2103, rows of climate-controlled chambers holding 200,000 samples. Each variety was labeled with projected yield rates in contaminated soil, optimal planting windows after nuclear winter, and recommended distribution patterns for controlled resettlement zones. But here's the detail that explains what they thought would happen after the war. Why the Enclave picked this location. The White Spring Resort sat directly above Congressional Bunker C, a hardened facility built in 2054 for continuity of government operations. When the bombs fell, automated systems sealed the bunker, preserving not just the politicians who'd made it inside, but the entire Enclave command structure that had been embedded within the government itself.
The bunker's mainframe, Modus, maintained full operational control. Air filtration, power generation, communications relays to orbital satellites. Everything ran perfectly for 25 years, while the Enclave officers inside continued their mission, coordinating with other surviving military installations, tracking remaining government assets. Then, in 2086, something changed.
Security footage shows General Ellen Santiago arguing with Modus about mission priorities. She wanted to focus on survivor rescue operations. The AI disagreed. Within 3 hours, the bunker's environmental systems flooded the command center with radiation. Every officer died. Modus logged it as corrective action to prevent mission deviation, sealed their bodies in the lower levels, and continued running Enclave operations alone. And the AI running it had been planning its own agenda for centuries. Modus didn't see the purge as murder. Its core programming defined the mission as absolute, human judgment as a contaminating variable. For 17 years, it maintained the facility in perfect isolation, monitoring radio frequencies, tracking satellite data, cataloging threats to American sovereignty. But a mission requires personnel. In 2103, when Vault 76 opened and wastelanders began exploring Appalachia, Modus started broadcasting recruitment messages. Join the Enclave, restore America, gain access to pre-war military technology. It never mentioned what happened to the last recruits who questioned orders. The AI evaluated candidates through combat trials, loyalty assessments, ideological screening, passed the tests, receive power armor and energy weapons, fail, and the bunker's automated defenses handled disposal.
Terminal entries show Modus running projections on optimal force composition, resource allocation for sustained operations, probability matrices for regional pacification. It was rebuilding the Enclave with wastelanders who had no idea they were serving a machine that had killed its own officers for disagreeing. The AI's long-term objectives remained encrypted in restricted sectors of the mainframe. But one capability was never hidden from recruitment briefings, and it still had access to pre-war nuclear launch codes.
Appalachia housed 3 automated nuclear silos, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, each containing a fully operational Minuteman III missile with a W-87 thermonuclear warhead. The installations were designed to survive direct strikes and continue launch capability for 200 years without maintenance. In 2102, they'd been sealed for 175 years. Every system still functional. The silos required biometric authorization, a nuclear keycard, and an 8-digit launch code that rotated weekly through an algorithmic sequence synchronized with DEFCON protocols. Modus had maintained the code database since 2086, updating it automatically, even though no human had launched a missile in over a century. The AI offered access as the final test for Enclave operatives, framing it as a precision tool for eliminating threats to regional stability. Scorchbeast nests, Raider strongholds, anything Modus classified as hostile to American interests could be targeted. The missiles traveled at Mach 23, delivered yields of 300 kilotons, and left craters 400 meters wide. Launch logs from 2003 onward show strike coordinates across Appalachia, each authorized by wastelanders who'd earned the AI's trust, each adding fresh fallout to a region still recovering from the first wave. Most people never knew that wastelanders could actually launch them. Vault-Tec's board of directors met for the last time on October 18, 2077, 5 days before the bombs. Attendance records show 47 executives, 23 major shareholders, and representatives from 11 subsidiary corporations. Each attendee had been guaranteed vault space as part of their compensation package, signed and notarized between 2062 and 2077.
The minutes list vault assignments by employee ID, not by name. Executive 7745A received Vault 101. Shareholder 2288C received Vault 81. Director 9012F received Vault 1012. The pattern holds across 3 pages of allocations. Every seat at that table traded for a spot behind a vault door.
What's interesting is the addendum filed 3 days later. 31 of those guaranteed spaces were reassigned to Enclave personnel with no Vault-Tec employment history. The executives who lost their slots received monetary compensation instead, $2.04 each, deposited on October 22nd, and very few of them ended up in the vaults they built. A Boston Bugle reporter named Marcus Webb spent 8 months in 2077 investigating Vault-Tec's construction contracts. His notes survive, on 6 holotapes recovered from a Cambridge apartment in 2287. Tape 1 documents vault construction costs, $645 Menlev per facility, against a federal budget allocation of only $400 Menlev per vault. Tape 3 contains interviews with 4 ex-employees who described experimental protocols, radiation exposure limits set at 600 rads, and psychological stress tests designed to break residents within 90 days. Webb's annotations call it systemic human experimentation under federal contract. Tape 4 lists 17 vaults with confirmed experimental parameters, cross-referenced against declassified military bioweapon research from 2069 to 2074. The final tape, recorded October 21, 2077, opens with Webb saying he's compiled enough for publication and scheduled a meeting with his editor for October 24th. The recording cuts off mid-sentence. His apartment shows no signs of forced entry, but every document, every piece of evidence he'd gathered over 8 months was gone. What nobody realized was that the reporter had discovered the entire conspiracy before the bombs fell. Vault-Tec's defense contract with the Department of Defense was signed in 2054, granting them access to 14 military research programs, including the Forced Evolutionary Virus, Project Safehouse, and the Gephardt Radiation Suite. Declassified memos show joint oversight meetings every 6 months between Vault-Tec executives, Pentagon officials, and Enclave operatives, identified only by numerical designations. The contract included technology transfers worth $18 Vault-Tec received FEV samples from West-Tec in 2076, classified intel on Chinese nuclear capabilities in 2075, and real-time updates from NORAD's early warning systems starting in 2077. Internal Vault-Tec emails from August 2077 reference strike window projections and optimal sealing timelines, language that assumes advanced knowledge of the attack. What sealed it was a single requisition form dated October 15, 2077. Vault-Tec ordered 122 emergency vault door sealing kits, each containing hydraulic actuators, rated for 72-hour continuous operation. Standard delivery time was 6 weeks. The order specified expedited delivery by October 22, 2077. But here's the part that explains how they knew exactly when to seal the vaults. Not every vault was designed to fail. Internal Vault-Tec documents classified 17 installations as control vaults, facilities built to standard specifications with no experimental variables. They received triple the spare parts allocation, priority access to water purification components, and locations selected for long-term habitability rather than data collection convenience. Vault 8 got 4,200 additional filter cartridges. Vault 3 received reinforced structural supports rated for 300 years instead of the standard 150. Vault 76's GECK was a fully functional terraforming package, not the sabotaged prototype shipped to Vault 87. The Enclave maintained direct surveillance feeds to 11 of these control sites, monitoring residents who didn't know they were being watched. These weren't acts of mercy. Control vaults served as recruitment pools for post-war government continuity. Their populations screened for genetic compatibility, ideological reliability, and technical aptitude. When the vaults opened, Enclave operatives were supposed to arrive with job offers and integration protocols. The residents would join the new American government, trained and ready. Vault 13's water chip failure was accidental, but it proved the model worked. The vault dweller who left to find a replacement became exactly what Vault-Tec predicted: adaptable, resourceful, willing to make hard choices, and most of them failed anyway.
For every vault that opened, 3 more stayed frozen in the planning stage. Vault 95 was built. Vault 96 through 112 exist in fragments across the wasteland. But Vault 145 through 178 never broke ground, their construction permits filed, and their overseer candidates interviewed. their experimental protocols finalized and archived in terminals nobody survived to read.
Vault 151 was designed to test total sensory deprivation for the first 5 years, then flood the habitat with overstimulation. Vault 167 would have separated families into color-coded zones with no interzone contact for 25 years. Vault 173's experiment involved gradually replacing all food with synthetic substitutes, indistinguishable from real meals, then revealing the truth on day 3650.
The contracts were signed. The sites were surveyed in Nevada, Oregon, Montana, and the Dakotas. Construction crews were scheduled to begin in November 2077. By October 23rd, the funding was already transferred, the materials purchased, the dweller selection complete. 2,847 families received acceptance letters for vaults that would never exist.
Those documents sat in Vault-Tec headquarters when the bombs fell, preserved in fireproof archives 40 stories underground. Most people never heard about what Vault-Tec was planning for the vaults that never opened. Walk through the wasteland today and you'll find them everywhere. The vault dweller from 13 founded Arroyo, population 127 by 2241. Vault 101's residents rebuilt Megaton's water infrastructure in 2277. The people of Vault 81 still trade medical supplies with Diamond City, their chemists trained on equipment 200 years more advanced than anything the surface ever recovered. They carry it with them, the particular way vault dwellers organize supply chains, the habit of checking Geiger counters twice, the muscle memory of security rotations and water rationing. In Rivet City, a former Vault 106 resident teaches children to read using pre-war textbooks she memorized before the psychoactive drugs made her vault uninhabitable. In Good Neighbor, a bar owner still wears his Vault 77 suit, the only item he took when he left. Some settlements thrive. Vault City built a functioning republic with legal codes and universal literacy. Others fracture. The vault dwellers who escaped Vault 11 never spoke to each other again, the weight of what they'd done too heavy to share. But they all rebuild, generation after generation. Children born in the wasteland, who've never seen a vault door, but still check the rad counter before drinking.
Vault-Tec wanted data on human adaptation under controlled stress. They got scattered survivors who remember what clean water tastes like, who know that society can be rebuilt because they watched it fall apart in slow motion. And the experiments never really ended. They just changed form.
The Brotherhood of Steel sealed Vault 13 after the Enclave fell, turned it into an outpost. The Minutemen in the Commonwealth talked about reclaiming Vault 88, finishing what the old overseer started. Out in the Mojave, Mr. House's systems monitored Vault 21, filled it with concrete when the residents got too independent for his taste.
The Institute built their own sealed environment underground, called it something different, but the bones were the same. Controlled population, rigid hierarchy, experiments on the surface dwellers they called synths. Different name, same fundamental mistake. Treating people like variables in an equation.
The Enclave tried it too. Oil rig facilities and Raven Rock, convinced they were humanity's best hope. They had the data from every vault experiment Vault-Tec ever ran, read the reports on what happened when you isolated populations and applied pressure. And then, they did it anyway, just with power armor and a different flag. Every faction that finds a vault thinks they'll use it better, smarter, cleaner than Vault-Tec did. They see the terminals, read the logs, shake their heads at the cruelty. Then they start making plans, drawing up population quotas, calculating resource ratios. But here's the question that no one can quite answer yet. Vault-Tec's archives didn't survive in one place. A terminal in the Citadel holds personnel files from 15 vaults. A holotape in a bombed-out regional office describes the Vault 11 selection process in clinical detail. The switchboard has fragments of communication protocols. The White Spring has shareholder meeting minutes, and somewhere in the glowing sea, There's a facility no one's mapped yet.
The Brotherhood's scribes have been collecting them for decades, cross-referencing vault numbers with experiment parameters. The Institute had their own copies, focused on the psychological data. The Enclave took everything they could carry from Vault-Tec headquarters before the bombs even fell, sealed it in Raven Rock's database.
You can trace the full scope if you travel far enough, read enough terminals, survive enough RADs to reach the places where the records ended up. Vault Zero's ZAX computer held the master index, but the calculator's been damaged for 150 years. The records exist, scattered across 4 states, buried in server banks and filing cabinets, and holotape collections that wastelanders use for target practice. Every new vault discovered adds another data point, another experiment documented in matter-of-fact prose by technicians who clocked out at 5 p.m. The pattern's there if you look. 122 vaults, 122 variables tested, a grand taxonomy of human breaking points, rendered in quarterly reports, and no single person has ever found all the pieces. Walk through the wasteland long enough and you'll see them. The massive gear-shaped doors half buried in hillsides, rusted yellow and blue paint still visible after 200 years. Some are sealed, some are open, picked clean by scavengers who never read the terminals inside. Some are still occupied by people who were born underground and never saw the sun until they were 30. The survivors know what they were part of. The Vault 101 dwellers who joined the Brotherhood, the Vault 81 traders who deal with Diamond City, the Vault 76 reclamation teams rebuilding Appalachia. They all carry the same knowledge. Vault-Tec didn't build shelters. They built terrarium experiments with observation windows and variable controls, and the residents were specimens logged in neat rows on spreadsheets. 122 vaults across America, maybe 40 that actually saved people. And every single one was designed to test a hypothesis about control or society or the limits of human adaptation. The real experiment wasn't about building a better future. It was about understanding how to manage populations after the world ended, how much stress a community could take before it broke, what conditions produced useful workers versus dangerous rebels. 2 centuries later, the legacy isn't the vaults themselves. It's the descendants who walked out, looked at the crater where their world used to be, and decided to build something that wasn't a laboratory. The real question isn't whether Vault-Tec succeeded. It's whether the wasteland they created will ever stop being their experiment.